Good evening, everyone. We are continuing with our study of Swami Kriyananda's recollection of Paramahansa Yogananda's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. Gita is a small book, the commentary is not, but we're making our way through it. So let's start with a prayer and a few minutes of meditation, then we'll go into our discussion. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Bless us that your wise and loving presence enter into our hearts, enter into our minds, and inspire and guide us that we may follow the path, the way of living and thinking and being that leads us to the greatest happiness through attunement with thee. Om. Peace. Amen. Om. Peace. Amen. So, my friends, we are now in the last two stanzas of chapter 6 of the Bhagavad Gita, which Swami in his explanation is called the true yoga. So now, chapter 6, verse 46. The yogi is greater than those ascetics who strive for spiritual perfection through discipline of the body, greater even than those who follow the path of wisdom, jnana yoga, or of action, karma yoga. Become, O Arjuna, a yogi. Now, we have to sort of understand what we're talking about when we're talking about these words. Yoga is the scientific method of working toward God realization. And the essence of what that actually means is when we come to understand how the life force and the energy actually operates in the body, and we begin to take up those practices which can affect that energy directly. The way the what we call the Kundalini force, of course, the inner spiritual energy, and the chakras, which run down the center of the body and the spine, which have a sort of an observable physiological component because they are nerve centers from which many nerves radiate out physically. But the real nature of those centers is that they hold the energy pattern of what we're doing, of who we are. We are the pattern in the chakras more than we are anything else. I mean, the way to think about it is like this: if you have a blueprint for a building, and you're going to construct that building, you take the blueprint and then you manifest exactly what that blueprint says to do, and then you have the physical building that results. The chakras are the energy pattern of our consciousness developed over many incarnations, and when what we manifest in the material world is the result of that pattern, the blueprint. We add energy to the blueprint, just the same way that a builder adds energy to the architect's blueprint. The blueprint itself is not a building, but the builder looks at it and he adds energy, material energy, and then what is on the blueprint is manifested. So with us, we have this subtle energy force within us, which is the blueprint that's stored in the chakras. And when the physical body dies, that energy blueprint is what goes into the astral world. So we are still clearly ourselves in the astral world. We don't, as Swami put it to me, very just simply, nothing happens when you die. I mean, you take off your body, but nothing actually happens to you, because through this body we are constantly manifesting the energy pattern of the chakras, and when the physical body dies, the energy pattern is still there to be manifest, and we go into an energy universe where we manifest in a non-physical way. And that chakra system, this is so important to understand. When we get this picture really clear in our mind, everything about life and everything about the spiritual path, and even more profoundly, how to live correctly and why, really becomes really deeply ingrained. Otherwise you sort of think you can get away with things, and one is always looking for a way to sort of outsmart the system. But when you get it very, very deeply, understanding how the chakras work and how the physical body is a manifestation and everything in life is a manifestation of the energy pattern in the chakras, what happens to us is we become very interested in what creates that energy pattern, and even more powerfully, how to modify it. Because if you're going to be giving the blueprint for your building to someone else to construct, you just need to make sure that that blueprint says exactly what you want it to say. And if you want it changed, you change the blueprint, then you give it to the one who's putting the energy into it. They make that new modification. Well, of course, it's all us. But nonetheless, if you can modify the energy directly, then you can modify the expression. You can modify the manifestation of your life. And this is what the yogis figured out. The yogis figured out by turning their attention inward and asking the question over and over again, who am I? What is real? Where does happiness come from? Why do I have the fate that I have? And with deeper and deeper introspection, the secrets of the energy, of the inner realities just began to open to them. And that's what the state of enlightenment, increasing God realization is. And so from ancient times, when the highly advanced souls conducted these right experiments, they all discover the same thing. Even though we consider yoga to be somewhat of an India, Eastern kind of practice, when you read carefully the mystical writings of many Catholic saints, Saint Teresa of Avila being one, but many of them, you realize they're talking about exactly the same thing, because they discovered it. They meditate deeply. They find that their eyes are drawn upward. They see a great light in front of them. They see the rivers of energy and the 7 candlesticks. Master says the Book of Revelation by John has nothing to do with the end of the world externally. He called it pure yoga. Every image in there was John going deep into the inner reality and perceiving it. He put it forward more symbolically, because in the time and place that he was writing, that was the only way that he could express it. The yogis can say it much more directly. So what the ancient sages and masters have presented to us is how to modify that inner energy. Because if we can modify the inner energy, that's what actually makes us master of our destiny. And so this is where the verse in the Gita says, the yogi, the one who works directly, scientifically to modify the inner energy, is greater than those ascetics who strive for spiritual perfection through discipline of the body. So that's the beginning. And then in the commentary, Swami spends quite a bit of time talking about, he says, the goal of physical discipline is twofold. It's very interesting because physical discipline has been historically a fundamental part of spiritual practice. Some way or another, we undertake austerities that we manifest through the physical body, reducing food, reducing sleep, reducing comforts in various ways. The goal of physical discipline is twofold: to bring the body under the control of one's will, and to rechannel the energy from the body so that the energy can serve a higher purpose. And then he goes on to talk about the somewhat barbaric custom that became popular for a time in the Christian monasteries, which is now prohibited, of actually torturing the body, like whipping the body in some way. It's just like it wants things that the devotee decides he doesn't want, and he tries to punish the body for wanting those things. Swami talks about how that temptation actually it comes first from the mind, that the body influences us, of course. We have physiological impulses within the body, but it's really the mind that is attracted. And so there's no point in just torturing the body, because the mind is the place where it's going to be attracted from. It is the more powerful force. It's not that the body is irrelevant, but it's the more powerful force. So he says the twofold purpose of physical discipline. One is to simply exercise the will. Master, actually, because we're moving into Dwapara Yuga, a great deal of everything that we know about spiritual life has been through the Kali Yuga form, and the Kali Yuga is the age of matter, in which the subtler realities are harder to see, and so things tended to be boxed in somewhat just much less subtle ways of doing it. So Master's original contribution to the practice of yoga, interestingly, is the energization exercises, and it's a series of things that you do with your body, which takes about 12 minutes to do. It's not calisthenics. It's based on consciously drawing energy into the body and then directing it with the will, and through tension and relaxation and certain coordinated breathing. One just simply stands up and does the exercises. The purpose of those is precisely to bring the physical body under the command of the will, and to take the physical energy, and instead of having it run us, that we choose how that energy is expressed. And so even though the energization exercises use the physical body as a means, we're not actually training the body, we're training the mind and the willpower to be able to draw energy at will and direct it as we choose. Now think about that for a minute, because everything that we do in life is a reflection of the quantity and the quality of energy we're able to put forth. Energy is the most fundamental factor in actually everything that we do, and certainly everything that we do on the spiritual path. Much of the time, when we feel discouraged or sad or unhappy or we don't do competent work or whatever it might be, if you trace it back, it's always a lack of energy or a lack of capacity to direct the energy. That the energy just gets scattered out in unproductive work, or one just doesn't have the vitality to do it. I saw a TED talk that was given by a man who had suffered from absolutely crippling depression. Just his life for a long time was just simply ruled by the fact that he was so depressed. And then he managed to find a psychiatrist who actually adjusted him pharmacologically, and he recovered. But he said from experience that people think the opposite of depression is happiness. He said that's not true. The opposite of depression is vitality, which is to say energy. And he talked himself about just becoming absolutely paralyzed with depression. He said he couldn't get out of bed. He talked about sort of the turning point was he lay in bed for about 2 hours with the phone within reach, trying to get up the energy to call his father. And he finally was able to call his father, and his father helped rescue him, and then everything got better after that. But it's very interesting if we think about ourselves. The lack of vitality is what cripples our capacity to live effectively in this world. And I was starting to say, if you analyze your own processes, well, you'll often see that difficulties arise when there isn't enough energy. So Master presents this simple truth that our bodies are made up of energy. If you do the scientific experiment, Master put it like this. This was his way of presenting it. He said he pinched his hand like that. He said there's enough energy, meaning if you get down to the atomic structure, there's enough energy in one pinch of flesh to keep the city of Chicago in electricity for an entire week. I mean, it's a very vivid idea. You look at this, and I think, well, I'm too tired to wash the dishes, I'm too tired to finish the project I have to work on. I'm too tired to have a conversation at the moment. When in fact, we are abuzz with energy, but we don't have conscious control over that energy. And it takes willpower to have conscious control, but it also takes the ability to direct that energy. So that's the second half of what he says, is to rechannel the energy from the body so that energy can serve a higher purpose. So with the energization exercises which Master brought to us, we are able to decide that I will have energy in my hands, I will have energy in my arm, and now I will consciously relax the energy in my hand, relax the energy in my arm, and then I will direct that energy to another body part. And if we do these exercises as Yogananda teaches them, and as you can learn them from Ananda or from Self-Realization Fellowship and probably other places too, what gradually begins to happen is we get control over the energy flow in our body. And we're starting with just the external energy used through the physical form. And that's because that energy is so accessible to us. We can just, I can send energy to my fist and I can clench my fist just like that. And virtually everyone can start with that. And then we get more and more subtle with it. But what it becomes is that when I need energy, I can draw it into me. And it's not merely that I can tense and relax the muscles of my body, but I can pull that energy into my mind if necessary, or into my heart if necessary. I can activate the energy that is accessible to me in the universe by a conscious act of will. And in Master's method, and of course then the rest of what Master teaches us is once we've trained the will through the energization exercises, then we can take that energy and use it in a more and more subtle way. And that's where we redirect the energy that's in the body, we channel it for a higher purpose. And of course, that's exactly what we do when we meditate. We repudiate all of the ways in which the physical body traditionally expresses itself by touch, by taste, by sight, by sound, by talking, all of these different ways, by movement, by shifting the world in different ways. We repudiate all of it for the period of meditation. But the trick about meditation is that we are accustomed to repudiating our physical involvement in the material world. But what we tend to do is when we come to that juncture of having repudiated physical involvement, we tend to lower our energy, because that's just how we go to sleep. And a very vivid picture of how this works is an illustration. If I had a whiteboard, I would show you, but you make a straight line and then you put a Y here. It's like the very simple letter Y that you would print in the capital Y in the most simple way, then you lay it on its side. And the stem of the Y here is our extended energy involved with the world. And then when we want to withdraw our involvement with the world, we roll back. We stop moving, we stop talking, we stop eating, we stop listening, we stop looking. We just roll that back. And then you come to the V part of where the capital Y would be, where the point of the V meets the stem of the letter, and then there's a crossroads that you can go to. So one crossroads is we've rolled back from the world, and now we just completely withdraw our energy and we sink downward into subconsciousness. If any of you have ever have trouble falling asleep, which I do sometimes, I'll roll back to this point and I'll just be relaxing, and then bang, some thought will come into my mind. Just something. It's not always even a worry. Sometimes it's an anxiety, but sometimes it's just a thought. And then my brain lights up, and I just know, oh dear, I'm not going to be able to go to sleep now. And sometimes I have to just get re-involved in the world and do something to bring my energy down again, because too much has gone into my brain. So, but when we're meditating, now we do sit up straight when we meditate, not lie down, because the association with sleep is so strong when you lie on your back. And there's reasons to have the spine upward. But you roll back in exactly the same way, even to the point of complete relaxation, letting go of all thoughts and worries. You reach that same juncture, but then you take all the energy that would normally be expressing itself through the material world, through your physical body, and you concentrate that energy upward. You rechannel it for a higher purpose. And that higher purpose is to put all that energy at the point between the eyebrows, in which then the inner organs of perception, that's how it's described, the inner organs of perception are activated. And they can even look at it with brain scans. Other parts of your brain are activated. And all of a sudden one is fully engaged with even more energy than one uses through one's body. But you're perceiving a non-material world at that point. But the ability to do that depends on your ability to concentrate and the ability to both draw and direct energy. And that's why Master invented the energization exercises. And that's why, for those of us who have taken the time to learn them and use them often enough, we begin to understand what an extraordinary force that is. Now, Master's teaching goes several steps beyond that, so that once one has all one's energy withdrawn from the physical and directed toward the spiritual eye, then you can begin to work subtly with the inner flow of energy, which is related to the inhalation and the exhalation. But the inhalation and the exhalation are but the outward manifestation of a much deeper flow of energy, which is not physical at all, but accessing through the breath or through the inner ear, the inner capacity to hear. We temporarily exit from material awareness, and we enter into the more subtle world, in which we can then begin to influence that inner energy. We literally begin to shift the energy in the chakras. And this is what Kriya Yoga is. Kriya simply means action. But Master gave that name to a specific kind of action that has a profound effect. So when Krishna says, be a yogi, he's not talking, he's talking very specifically. He's talking about commit yourself to work, to train yourself to work directly with the energy. Because all other practices are indirect in the hope of influencing that energy. But if we can just work directly with that energy, that's why in Autobiography of a Yogi, in the chapter called Kriya Yoga, Master calls the practice of Kriya Yoga the airplane route to God, as opposed to the bullock cart route. Because you can influence that inner energy by outward actions, but it's much less efficient. But if you can, because the pattern of energy that's in the spine, that's in the chakras, that pattern of energy is our karma. And what that is, it is those, let's see, karma, one definition of karma is unlearned lessons remaining to be learned. And lessons it goes this way, that we define ourselves in a certain way, and we believe our happiness, it comes from and is dependent upon certain, the world conforming, our life experience conforming to certain ideas we're holding in our heads. And those ideas are not located in the brain, actually. They're located up and down the spine in these vrittis. And a vritti is a whirlpool. And the nature of a whirlpool is that there's some center point that keeps the energy moving in a circle. It doesn't, the energy can't go forward because it's held by the center point in this whirlpool. If you have ever spent time on down at a river, in the Ananda village where I lived for many years, is close to the Yuba River, and you go down to the Yuba River, and I've always loved watching water move. I just can watch water move for a really long time. So here's the river flowing, and because it's a wild river, trees fall into it, rocks come up, silt builds up, just the different dynamic of the way the contours of the land or the water flows. Water goes in a flood and it upsets the bank. And often these whirlpools develop. So there's this direct flow of water, but some of that water is siphoned off into some kind of just a swirling mass. And so to the extent that this water is swirling, to that extent this direct flow of energy is diminished. And there's always something that's holding that whirlpool. You know, as I say, a tree, a rock, a contour of the land, an old car, a dead animal, you know, just can be any number of things. But something is determining that pattern, and all this energy swirls around that center point. And as long as the flow of the river toward the sea is less powerful than the hold that the center point has on the water. You see, it's a dynamic of energy. So if the river flow is not that strong, and the magnetic lock on the energy is stronger, then the whirlpool will constantly win. And a certain amount of the energy will be devoted to maintaining the whirlpool. If the river suddenly goes into flood, if the dam is opened higher up the stream, or if the snow melt happens, and this gets tremendously powerful, all of a sudden the forward momentum to the sea is stronger than whatever has that water locked, and it's broken. Just the hold of the center point is broken, and the center point ceases to be anything at all. It just was nothing. If it's a physical thing, it'll just get swept in and just washed away. And all the water that was just going in a circle, now all of a sudden is going into forward momentum. It's exactly what's going on inside of us. That's why they call them vrittis, which means a whirlpool. It's exactly what it is. Our karma is a vritti. And we have a commitment to some center point of energy, some desire, some aspiration. It can also be a regret, a worry, a fear, something that's strong enough that it attracts energy whirling around it. It can be hatred. Something happens and I hate a certain ethnic group, I hate a certain person, I hate a certain kind of energy or attitude, and these, can be in past lives. Maybe your whole family was killed by soldiers of a particular country or particular race. Maybe they were white people who killed you, or black people who killed you, or whatever it might be, and you hate them for doing so. And so you have this constant, all this energy is devoted to holding on to this thing that happened. And so then when you meet that energy again, you believe that this is the cause of your suffering. And then you add more energy to it with thought, with feeling, perhaps with action. And as long as that center point remains in place, then that's what will happen, and that's karma. And it's an unlearned lesson, because we believe, that my happiness depends on punishing these people. My happiness depends on avoiding these people. My happiness depends on getting revenge on these people. My happiness depends on my never, ever giving up my anger and my hatred. This is just the way people feel. Or it can be just it can be something positive. I saw a picture in the newspaper of a movie star. I don't know why she struck me as a starlet. I would say an aspiring movie star. She had, the perfect body, the perfect face. She was wearing some costume I think was made out of leopard skin or something. I mean, she was just, and I don't know why it struck me. I have no idea who she was, and I just saw it in the newspaper. But I thought, oh my God, for so many lifetimes she's been working to just be just like this. I want to be a very sexy woman who gets recognized in the film industry. And you can see how life after life she would cultivate that. And from the astral world, she would look for the genetic combination that would make her look a certain way, or maybe she got old and they cast her aside and, she's going to come back and do it again. I could just feel the center point, so many things. And because I believe that my happiness comes from being a very successful movie star. And it's an unlearned lesson because in the end, all our happiness comes from being in tune with God. And the whole drama of all these lifetimes that we live through is just having that karma manifest and us getting to find out just how happy it makes us or how happy it doesn't make us. And so it's karma, it's an unlearned lesson. I was remembering an article I read in a magazine many years ago, but it struck me very deeply because it's so illustrative. A woman's daughter was murdered on the street by a drug-crazed person who wanted her purse to buy drugs, and she resisted giving it to him, so he shot her or stabbed her, whatever he did, took the purse, ran away. And he was caught. He was convicted. He was not executed, but he was put in jail, I believe, for life. I don't know. So it's done. That's what's happening. The daughter is dead. The man is incarcerated. But the mother realized she was just obsessively obsessed with hatred for the man who had killed her daughter. And after a number of years, she began to realize that he had killed her daughter, and now he was killing her, because the hatred was so corrosive inside of her. But she just was holding on to it. Somehow, this is how I express my love for my daughter, is I hate the man who killed her. And she finally was suffering so much, she began to realize how much she was suffering, and she also could see that she would develop some horrible disease if she kept on like that. So in desperation, she went to the prison, and she asked to see him. So she's there talking to this man who has killed her daughter, who's now, I've actually visited inside a maximum security prison in California. It's a very unusual experience because you're in this maximum security place and you've had to go through all these airlocks, so to speak. You go through, there's a locked door that opens, and then you step in here and the locked door slides shut behind you. Then the next door opens and you can step through that, and then that locks behind you. So you go through multiple layers of this if you're in a maximum security. So by the time you get to the end of it, there's a lot of protection, and there's still all these men and women around with loaded weapons. And you're sitting in some kind of a visitor's room, assuming that you can have that kind of visit, not just through glass. You're sitting in an actual visitor's room. But all the people who have been convicted of many cases of very violent crimes, they're powerless. So, they're just sitting around. You're just sitting in this multi-purpose room with all these people. You don't know who or, what they really are. So she's sitting in here visiting with this convicted murderer, and she expresses to him what her life has been since her daughter was murdered. This is the remarkable part. The murderer had never cognized the fact of the implications of taking that woman's life. All he thought of was, she has money, I want drugs, she won't give me the money, I'm going to just get rid of her and get the money anyway. And so seeing this mother, because of course he had a mother too, seeing this mother grief-stricken, he realized what his actions had created. And he never knew it before. I mean, that's a very profound level of ignorance to not understand, but he didn't. It just had never come to him that his actions had consequences. Talk about an unlearned lesson. But that's the same with all of us. This is just a more dramatic example. Even for the mother, she had to learn that hating someone who has hurt me is not really going to bring me the happiness I want. And of course, the end of the story is that by the end, she loved him like a son. And her love for him completely transformed him. I mean, talk about working out karma. Now, here's the amazing part of this. You see, all of this was just energy. It was just energy in the chakras originally. The blueprint was just energy in the chakras. This man's addiction to drugs, his inclination for violence, his belief that if I can get what I want, I'll be happy, I don't have to think about anyone else. That mother's belief that all my happiness comes from my daughter, and if my daughter's not with me, then I must be unhappy, that what somebody does to me warrants my hating them. All of this is just a pattern in the chakras. And they had life experiences that were powerful enough to break the vritti. They just, and so the suffering of the mother, the murderer's perception that this mother was suffering, all of those different things, something came in that broke the vritti. It was the flow of the river was stronger than the whirlpool. Now, what a yogi does is a yogi increases the flow of the river. That's what we're doing when we're meditating. When we're meditating at all, if you're meditating toward the spiritual eye, which is to say, if you're drawing energy up the spine and not just spinning it in the chakras. So that's why the right kind of meditation is very important. And furthermore, in Kriya Yoga itself, we actually circulate the inner energy through the chakras in a particular way, especially as you learn the higher Kriyas, you really begin to work very directly with the energy in the chakras. And what you gradually do is you increase the inner flow sufficiently that the vrittis begin to dissolve into that flow of energy. And you won't even know that they have dissolved. And this is how real spiritual growth happens, often in ways that we are not aware that it's happening. It's just, we just gradually feel happier, we feel lighter, and then something will occur, something will occur, and we discover that our habitual response is just not there anymore. Somebody says something insulting and one had a way of being very defensive, and it just doesn't occur to you to be defensive. It just doesn't occur to you because the vritti that made you think in order to be happy I have to behave this way has been drawn into the river, and you didn't even know it was gone. I had a very interesting experience. Ananda was we had a 12-year cycle of litigation, 2 lawsuits that were really 2 sides of the same coin, but they were actually 2 different ones. And one of them was a sexual harassment lawsuit. A very dishonest lawsuit, profoundly dishonest in countless ways, but for various reasons of karma, having to do with not having a good attorney, and also that the entire lawsuit was so preposterous that we were naive. We just didn't know how profoundly distorted the so-called justice system can be. And so we ended up having a verdict against us in the end. Not Well, it was unpleasant. Not a horrible life-ending verdict, but it was very unfortunate. But it was what was very interesting to me, and I have to say I was quite pleased with myself. The lawsuit was perpetrated by one person, one woman scorned, who didn't get what she wanted, so she took it all out on the whole community and on Swami Kriyananda. And when the verdict was actually announced, and she'd actually won a certain sum of money from us, and certain issues like this, my first thought was, oh, that poor girl. It was just really odd. She'd just been awarded all this money. Oh, that poor girl, I thought. Now she did this very dishonorable thing, and now she's won. She's actually going to get money. She's actually going to be able to say, I stood up and I did this and I did that. And I thought, oh, the karma for her is just going to get worse, because now she's got even a bigger vortex, a bigger vritti going. So that was one side, but the other side of it was myself, which was just like, wow, isn't that lovely? After all, and I was greatly involved in the legal process and all of that. So I was not I wasn't sued, but I wasn't a bystander. I was involved with the lawyers and very involved in it. But still, I just thought, there's no point, it's her karma, she's just going to have to take it. We'll just go on with our lives. Another one that totally amused me, I can't say it was as profound in my heart as the one I just said, but I still loved it. I just before the pandemic hit, which was would have been January of 2020, I guess, I was part of whatever year it was, I can't remember, but it was just before the pandemic. I helped lead a pilgrimage tour to Israel. Two groups, one was American and one was devotees from India. And when there was a particular place we went to, which was this cave, which was reputed to be a place where John the Baptist often went. And it was still somewhat isolated in terms of the development around it. It was just on a hillside. And it was a cave. It was a wonderful place. It was part of a Franciscan convent. So there were certain number of nuns and priests also around there. And the cave was about big enough, there were 30 of us, and when all 30 of us were inside the cave was pretty full. And I was sitting at the very far back, literally on the doorstep, and there was one of the Indian leaders of the trip was sitting next to me. His name is Shurjo. And we were chanting, our Indian style, because it was an Indian group. Shurjo had the harmonium, and he was chanting with a lot of vigor. And he was chanting Hindi words, maybe Sanskrit, or Hindi words. I think it was Hindi words. And in a very Indian style. And we were right at the doorway. And so it was very energetic. And apparently there was a priest somewhere around there who was quite disturbed by what he was hearing, because mostly when people come from other countries, they sing Christian hymns still, because that's who they are. So for yogis to come was very unusual. So just as he finished chanting, or maybe just because it was suddenly silent, I turn around and this very tall priest is standing behind me, a rather big, rather intimidating guy. And he says to me, "This is a Christian place," he says like that. And I mean, there were so many things I could have said to him, but I said, "We're here for Jesus." And he said, like, once again, "This is a Christian place." And I again said, "We're here for Jesus." I said, "We were about to meditate." "I hope it's a Christian meditation," he says. I said one more time, "We're here for Jesus." I wasn't quite that exaggerated, but my voice, this tiny little voice, I wasn't afraid of him. It was just, we're here for Jesus. There was no argument in my voice, is what I mean. It was just like, we're here for Jesus. But it was more small. And then we meditated, we had a wonderful time, and he said, "Well, I hope so," and then kind of walked away, and we never saw him again. But it's wonderful. I mean, for me, both of those incidences were just like, what happened to the vrittis that would have taken me in another direction? to be intimidated, to be afraid, to be argumentative. There were so many ways I could have responded to that priest, and none of them occurred to me. Just the little devotee's heart. We're here for Jesus. Oh, we're here for Jesus. Just, that's all. Or, poor girl, I don't need to spend any energy creating karma for myself. So be the yogi. That's who we're meant to be. Work directly on the energy. And then life really changes. It's the airplane route to God. So the rest of the verse, he also says, the yogi is greater than ascetics. And ascetics, you sometimes see because they're so dramatic. They're scarecrows. They're very thin. They only eat this. And you would see people hold their arms up in the air for their whole lifetime, or never sleep lying down, or all kinds of things. Now, sometimes you see that it's working for people, but often it doesn't. It just becomes, you become tense rather than free. And here Krishna is saying, the yogi, the one who works scientifically with the energy, that's the direct way. And then he says, he's greater even than those who follow the path of wisdom, which is jnana yoga, or of action, which is karma yoga. Now, both of those disciplines are all helpful. Jnana yoga is the power of the mind, that we constantly try to discriminate between the real and the unreal. And we use, again, the power of the will, but through the mind. That's what the jnana yoga does. We realize that this world is a dream, that even though there is this multitudinous, seeming multitude of separate realities, in fact, all is Brahma. And jnana yoga is extremely helpful, but as Master says, it's also indirect. Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to break those vrittis. We're trying to break whatever single thought is held there. There's the practice of jnana yoga is described as neti, which is to say not this, not this, not this. We're asking the constant question, who am I? What am I seeking? Where does happiness come from? Where is Satchidananda, ever existing, ever conscious, ever new joy? We pick up one potential after another in the world, delicious food, beautiful sensual experiences, even just great art or great literature or great intellectual work. Neti. And by a process of neti, we eliminate all options. We work out our karma because we persuade ourselves that my happiness lies only in the direction of God. But again, it's indirect. It's powerful, but it's indirect. The yogi is working all the time on the energy. And so if we discipline the body in an appropriate, moderate way, we focus the mind as much as we can, and all of these work together. I'm laughing in my heart because there was a time at Ananda village, and even at some of our communities, where we used to have these really elaborate, at Ananda village we had these really elaborate Halloween parties. They actually still do. Now they're very much focused around the children, and it's wonderful, but in the earlier years it was really the adults. It was just kind of we lived a very austere life, and Halloween sort of became a time when people could just be a little goofy. And one year, for myself and two of my friends, we went. My friend dressed up as the Tooth Fairy, and my other friend and I, she was the Sweet Tooth, and she wore this sort of white thing that made her look like a marshmallow with a lot of cavities, a lot of tinfoil on it, and she carried a lot of candy bars, and I was the Wisdom Tooth, and so I wore a piece of dental floss. It was meant to be, but it looked sort of like a Brahmin thread across my chest. And I had a little sign on that said neti, because I was the wisdom tooth. It was just so much fun, just to be ridiculous. But truthfully, ever since that time, even though we did it just for fun, I've always had a little affection for neti, not this, not this. And so when we combine these, Krishna doesn't say that these are useless practices. They say better to be a yogi. And the karma yogi Karma yoga is nishkam karma. That's the karma yogi. The karma yogi is the one who does what is right, puts his energy where it needs to be, but not for what I can get from it, but only for what I can give. Which is just, nishkam karma means action without desire for the fruits of the action. And so we train ourselves. And again, it's helpful. We train ourselves to live for what we can give instead of what we can get. Unlearned lessons. I don't need this, I don't need this, I don't need this. I just do what is appropriate and right of me, and I asked of me, and I just leave. I leave the result in God's hands, and it breaks the egoic conviction that certain things are required for my happiness. So these are the things that Swami suggests from this. Okay, so now this is the last verse of chapter 6. Chapter 6, verse 47. He who, full of faith and love, becomes fully absorbed in me, I regard as best attuned to my path to perfection. So Krishna is talking, full of faith and love. That I've had some interesting times in the last few days, just because I've been I give this course, and I give a couple of others ongoing. I've been developing a series that's Karma, Reincarnation, and the Chakras. That's the morning broadcast that I do, half an hour each lesson. And it's been designed, the intention of this is to explain these very important concepts to people who don't necessarily already understand them. Sometimes some of the series that I do are actually directed at people who are already deeply committed to the Ananda path, and I want to take some important aspect of it and go very deeply into it. The Karma and Reincarnation one that I'm in the process of creating right now is meant for people who are becoming familiar with it. So I don't have visions. I don't have big experiences that are outside the normal realm of things. But I find myself, I'm so completely persuaded of the fact of reincarnation and the truth about karma and the truth about the chakras. I have to stop every so often and just ask myself, how did I become so convinced of this? But I really am in my deepest self. I had an interesting, it's fun when you actually sort of accidentally fall into something and get to see who you've become, just as I was talking about a few minutes ago. There was a man, Stephen Levine. He's probably not on the planet anymore, but maybe he is. He was a groundbreaker in the death and dying, the field of death and dying. He was writing in the late 60s and 70s, when only he and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross were there. Now, of course, it's become it's another one of those wonderful examples of how consciousness is rising. People's regard toward death and dying and hospice and many other things. It's all developed in the last 50 years, which 50 years is a solid period of time, but it's my lifetime. And one of the things that Stephen Levine would do is he ran workshops for people who had terminal diagnoses. And he tried to help people, just through the process of dying. Not the actual moment when their body stopped functioning, but the fact that it was going to happen. And so he had them go through certain emotional, personal exercises. And one of them was that he asked them to make a list of everything that they would miss out on if they in fact died as the doctors warned them that they likely would. And so, somebody in their 40s, even in their 50s or 60s, maybe I'll never meet my grandchildren, maybe I'll never get married, maybe I'll never have children, maybe I won't get to complete my novel, maybe I'll never have the home I wanted, my parents will suffer. There's all these different things. Well, no, that's not meant. It's meant, what will I not get to do? And there it all is. And then you make that list, and naturally you grieve like anything over all the losses. And then he says, he has you make a different list. And that list is, what challenges are you going to get to just run away from and not have to face? Because now you're going to die. Oh, well, my career has never really gone anywhere I've wanted it to go, but now it doesn't happen. And I kept saying I was going to write the novel, but now I never have to write the novel. You know, just everything. You have a bad marriage, and now you don't have to worry about divorce. You're just going to run away, and you don't have to deal with it. Somebody else in your family has great problems you could never solve. You're about to go bankrupt. I mean, just make a long list. And now I don't have to deal with any of them. And it was interesting because the way he would work with people is what you get to avoid is often really the bigger issue that you have to think about. Like, how is this death going to help you? You think it's going to help you. Now, what was so interesting for me when I heard this many, many years ago, I thought, well, that's interesting. You know, why wait for a terminal diagnosis? Why not just write this down and start facing into these realities right away? But I realized that I couldn't put anything on the I get to avoid it list because my understanding of reincarnation and karma was so inescapable that I realized that merely dying would not solve anything. It would just postpone it. Whatever I was afraid of, whatever I didn't want to face, whatever it might be, it would just be hanging out in the astral world or in my next incarnation, or even still, it would bring me back. It would force me to reincarnate because I didn't have the courage to deal with it now. And the problem is, you see, there's no such thing as the future, it's always now. So you imagine that the future will not be now, but when the future comes, it's now. And myself, in my life, a lot, when I have to face something that I really wish God hadn't sent me, I often say to myself, facing this karma once is bad enough. I need to really learn everything I'm supposed to learn because I never want to see it again. I don't want to have it a second, a third, and a fourth. And of course, it's here now. But it's just interesting to me how very, very deep, and the word is faith, because it's not like I can actually say that I've experienced these things, but my faith in it has become so deep. And actually the word love is also there, because I trust that God is doing the right thing with me. There's no part of me. I may not like what's given to me, and I remember once I was very displeased with a challenge I was being asked to face. And I finally realized that my displeasure had actually crossed over into anger. And I was actually quite angry with the whole line of gurus, every one of them. And this is why I was angry. I was angry because I knew I was going to actually rise to the occasion and eventually master the karma that was wiping me out at the moment. And I knew it was going to be hard, and I didn't want to do it. And I was really annoyed that this is what Mother Teresa of Calcutta said. God never sends us a challenge that is greater than we can meet. And then she said, but sometimes I wish God didn't have such faith in my strength. It was so perfectly honest. You wouldn't send this to me if you didn't think I could do it, but good Lord, what makes you think I can do this? But faith and love, we know that we're being loved if we really know that we're being loved. And so we cultivate all these attitudes, faith, that karma must be fair and must be honest, meaning the divine law says it is, and that I am profoundly and deeply loved by God and Guru. And this, I am part of a greater reality, and that reality loves me and is working for my happiness and freedom far more effectively than I can work for myself. It's a very challenging teaching. And one really has to persevere against great odds. I remember when I was living still at Ananda Village, and my work was with the guest program. And for a while, I was responsible for the weekend workshops. And one of the weekends, there was this woman there from Sweden. And we often had visitors from other countries, but not like it is now, where people just travel so easily and so much. So having someone come all the way from Sweden to be at our Ananda retreat was a big deal. And so I was, we were just starting the weekend, and I was talking, and everybody was more or less saying how they got there. And this woman described this story, which was a very heartbreaking story. She'd had a sister. They were very close in age. They were deeply devoted to one another. They were each other's best friend. They were always happy because they could play together. And they planned out their lives, that they were going to always live near each other, that after they married and had children, their children would grow up together. It was a whole life. But sometime, this woman was probably not quite 30. But what had happened in her late 20s is her sister developed cancer and died. And the woman that was in front of me, she said it just absolutely devastated her. No part of her had ever considered that anything like that would happen. Her whole life was predicated on the fact that they'd always be together. So she said she suffered so much more deeply than she had ever suffered in her life, that she prayed more desperately than she'd ever prayed in her life. And because she prayed with such desperate energy, she received a response from God that was so profound and so beautiful, like nothing she'd ever even imagined was there. And so as a consequence of those realities, she became a spiritual seeker. She found Autobiography of a Yogi. She eventually found Ananda and crossed, thousands of miles to come and spend some time with us so she could understand more deeply what she'd experienced. And she was filled with light and joy when she would speak of her experience of God's response to her and all that had happened since, even though she would weep when she talked about her sister dying. So I took a great chance. It just came to me to do so. But I said, so given all of this and the importance now that this path has for you and what this will mean for the rest of your life and incarnations to come, do you think your sister's death was a tragedy? And fortunately, she took that in the spirit in which I asked it, which was not at all accusatory, but just, wow, how do you answer that question? And that's sort of where we have to go with love and faith. We have to really feel that. I was also remembering today, I was having another conversation, I remembered something I hadn't thought of in years. Starting in the year 1986, for 20 years, every year or every other year, with 3 friends, the 4 of us would lead a group of people to India, and we would go on a pilgrimage that was based on Autobiography of a Yogi, of the various places that were holy to Yogananda's life and that were talked about in that book. And in 1986, India was a very different country than it is now. Of course, everything changes, but India was still following what Mahatma Gandhi wanted, which was essentially for India to become a self-sustaining universe, separate from, to a large extent, from the rest of the world. And politically, the way that expressed was that India was closed to foreign corporations. Everything was homegrown. And actually, like in 1987 or 88, India opened its doors to foreign corporations, and it began the miracle that you see that is India now began at that point. As Swami Kriyananda put it, India is simply too important to the destiny of the planet to remain isolated. It has to participate and rise to take its right place in the modern world. But as a result, in that year, all the conditions were more extreme than they are now. And oftentimes, most of the people, almost all the people we took on all those trips, were all Americans, and almost all of them had never been outside of the Western world, so to speak, the developed world, the whatever you would. So you would go to India, we would go to India, and they would have experiences that they'd never had elsewhere. Beggars, lepers, people living on the street. Now, actually, a lot of people in America live on the street now, but it was a very different energy there. We stayed in the Oberoi Grand Hotel. At that time, also, there was only 2 tiers of hotels, basically that which Westerners would not be comfortable in, and 5-star hotels. And so we stayed in the 5-star hotels. And I developed my one super luxury taste is I love really, really, really nice hotels. It's a weakness that I still carry. But anyway, so we were staying in the Oberoi Grand Hotel in Calcutta, absolutely beautiful place, very refined. It wasn't extravagant. It was just a very refined hotel. I don't know what it's like now, but I loved it then. But you could be in your hotel room, and you could look down on the street. We were there for a week because there were lots of holy places to visit from Calcutta, and there would be a family like on the sidewalk. And you could, if you were there for several days, you were up several stories looking out your window, you could watch the life of the family on the sidewalk. That was where they lived, right there. And you saw worse. I mean, you just saw a lot of poverty and illness and things that were very distressing. And one of my roles in that was just, trying to keep everybody balanced, and also to help people process what they were learning. Pilgrimage is not vacation. Pilgrimage is an opportunity to put yourself in intensified spiritual atmospheres, which is your pilgrimage spots, which then is going to open you up to new realities. So there was a lot of working with how the energy was moving. And I began to realize after I did this, after we had a few trips, that people's response to poverty, to illness, to just very different circumstances, it varied enormously. I mean, we all had the same background, but some people just moved right in among the beggars, moved right in among the merchants, moved right in among the sidewalk dwellers, and were just loving and kind and appropriate and untroubled. And other people were just almost frantic at the presence, the unmistakable presence of very tough karma. And I gradually actually began to figure out that the way people responded to the suffering of others was entirely indicative to how reflective of how integrated they were about the suffering they themselves experienced. Because everybody suffers. Not everybody has the karma to suffer physically or financially or homelessly, but everybody suffers. Mother Teresa of Calcutta came and started a mission of charity work in New York City. And she commented that she felt that America was the most impoverished country she'd ever seen. And she worked in South American slums and Indian slums and all sorts of places. America was the most impoverished country because what America was impoverished in was love. She said the loneliness and the agonizing heartbreak of isolated people in America, she said, was far worse than people who were merely hungry. A very interesting comment, and she had earned the right to make it. Everybody suffers because we all have karma, and we're all going to be brought face to face with whatever we don't already know. And you can just count on it. And if your life is a little less touched by suffering, it's because you've worked through a lot in the past. But even all of our lives, Swami Kriyananda, Master himself, it's a painful world. And if you have transcended a preoccupation with your own suffering, then you're aware of the suffering of others. But the issue is if one has come to understand that suffering teaches me things I could not learn if I didn't. Just like I said to that Swedish woman, wow, it broke your heart for your sister to die, but was it really tragic that she died? Look at all that's happened to you that would never have happened otherwise, of supreme importance to your well-being for lifetimes to come. So were you being punished or were you being rewarded? You see how complicated it gets? And so people who are still in rebellion against the necessity for suffering just panicked at the sight of widespread suffering among others. And people who realize it's just karma, we all have karma, we face into the challenge with courage, we move on and we learn. And then they just would go through it easily. Very, very important lesson. Just over and over. Because see, what you're doing is you're rebelling against creation itself. And this is why he has the word faith and love. I have faith that I am part of a greater reality, and that greater reality is benign, and that greater reality loves me. Divine Mother knows what she's doing with me. And this is why so much in all that we do, we try to cultivate not just an intellectual idea of what's going on in the world, but also a heart feeling that there is a power in the presence and it is with me. That's why when Master was asked if he would be, after he died, if he would be as much with, a disciple said, will you be as much with us after you die as you are now? He said, to those who think me near, I will be near. And he meant think in the sense of those who call me, but also those who with faith and love know that I'll be with them. And all of these are vital. He who full of faith and love becomes fully absorbed in me, I regard as best attuned to my path for perfection. We become absorbed. And absorbed doesn't mean that we never think about anything else, but that when the pressure is on us, where do we instinctively turn? And those are the two stories I told you about my just sort of surrender in devotion to that priest. Instead of buying into the energy he was trying to put onto us, I'm just here for Jesus. You're making up this whole story about what's going on. We're here for Jesus. That's why we're here. And you can't calculate that right in the moment. It's just when someone pushes on you, you find out who you are. But you have to practice all the time. When I asked Swami that very critical question, like, how do I know what God wants of me in a moment of great panic and need? It was a theoretical question. He said, you practice when it's easier. Which is, how do we turn? How do we break? Even when little things happen. I remember this woman coming to me, and she was very, very angry with her mother. And, her mother had not done a very good job, and her mother had lots of weaknesses. So this woman's anger with her mother was not unwarranted. It was just there. But it was big. It was just this big energy that was sitting right in the middle of her, and she knew she shouldn't be angry, but she just kept saying, I shouldn't be angry, but she had so many reasons to be angry that she just couldn't break the vortex. I said, well, your anger, oftentimes the biggest quality that we see in us is also present in many other areas of our life. No, she said, I'm not angry at all. Just at my mother. And I didn't know her well, but I knew a little bit about her. What happens when someone cuts you off in the freeway? What happens when your coworkers leave their dirty dishes in the sink? What happens when you get to the market and you yourself have forgotten your grocery list? And she started recognizing that her response to not getting her way was to be angry. But she didn't think of it as important because it was just a grocery list, it was just a driver, it was just this. And I said, well, you don't have a chance of dissolving this anger with your mother. I mean, it's just way too big for you. But why don't you start breaking the habit of responding with anger? Just practice when it's easier. So if we really want to be absorbed in the divine, we have to practice when it's easier. Haridas, who's now a Nayaswami, lives in Bangalore. He's an American man, but he's a founding member of Ananda. You know, we've both been in this together for years. Haridas has a wonderful way of coming up with very clever ideas. And he had this acronym, which he called SPIDOG, SPIDOG, solve problems in direction of God. That's what he called it. he was so memorable with these things like that. SPIDOG, practice SPIDOG, which is just when something doesn't go your way, or whatever problem it is, turn immediately, solve the problem in the direction of God. Don't take a small solution. Just like, well, if somebody cut me off on the highway, I guess, Divine Mother, that you're saving me from a crash that I would have been in, or now. Or somebody doesn't do the dishes. Well, isn't this wonderful? You know, Divine Mother is going to train me to discipline my impatience, and I get to just wash these dishes and help my friends. Just always relate it to the highest that you can think of. That's my saying. Having this karma come once is one more time than I want. So I certainly don't want it to come again. Just go right to the end point. If I'm going to write down all the things that I get to avoid, there's nothing to write down, because there's nothing, I'm never going to be able to avoid facing what I have to face. Just go right to what the real issue is. Solve the problem at the highest level that you're capable of solving it. You have to be sincere, you have to be authentic, but it's directional. Just move in that way. Okay, now I'm going to just read one from chapter 7. We're moving now in the commentary book. When we move into chapter 7 of the Gita, we actually move into chapter 19 of the book. And chapter 7 of the Gita, Swami characterizes as knowledge and wisdom. I don't know if we move into chapter 8 or not, but that's what this chapter is called. Okay, so chapter 7, verse 1 says, "The blessed Lord said, O Arjuna, hear how, by following the path of yoga and absorbing yourself in my consciousness and taking shelter wholly in me, you will realize me wholly as I am, both in my infinite unmoving self and outwardly with all my attributes and powers. Knowing me thus, you will transcend every possibility of doubt." Now that's a big mouthful, that verse. So, by following the path of yoga, which is what we've just been talking about, by working directly with the inner energy and resolving to dissolve our karma by the concentration of will and focus. And then he says, and absorbing yourself in my consciousness. Now, absorbing yourself, I love that word, absorbing yourself. It means saturating yourself and surrendering yourself in the fact of the divine presence with you. And one of the reasons that we talk about the Guru, I personally talk a great deal about Swami Kriyananda, we can think of these things abstractly, or we can take that abstraction and we can focus it in on something that's closer to our own reality. That's the reason that the avatars come. That's the reason that the saints exist in the world. That's the reason that the human self, because we see ourselves as personal, it helps us if we can personalize our relationship in some way. It doesn't have to be an embodied being, but Master himself and all of the gurus who incarnate in physical bodies, who have actual human lives, who have experiences and faces and nowadays voices that we can see or recordings and film of them, or we can read their books or listen to their instruction. It takes what is abstract and it gives us a way to focus our attention, and also gives us an actual vibratory experience, and it's easier to be absorbed in it. I know because of all my years of attuning myself to Swami Kriyananda, hearing his words, studying his words, listening to his voice, listening to his music, it becomes, I use the word pole star often to describe what his reality is for me. Even from the very beginning, it's you can use the word guru, you can use the word saint, you can use the word teacher, but all of those, you have to give it some actual form. Pole star, for me, and it's a classic word, I don't make it up, is so vivid because it's a fixed point of reference. And that's exactly how I felt when I met Swami Kriyananda. Because I felt like I was just sort of ping-ponging around in my own life. There was no point of reference through which I could make sense of it. And then Swami Kriyananda was there, and he was physically manifested. He was only 44 when I met him, and he was 86 when he died. So, but what I saw in him was this clarity of consciousness, and it was coming through him, but it wasn't really him. It was just this clarity of consciousness. This is what it means to live for truth. And I had many different ways of articulating it. But then it becomes literally like the tambura in Indian music, where the instruments will improvise in all directions, and there is this constant tone, 3 strings, or 4 strings, ding, 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 I think it's 3 strings, just in the background. And it's just always there. No matter how wild this gets, it's always there, and everything relates to it. And the pole star was when you're out on the sea and you have no landmarks. You don't know where you are, but you can look at the pole star, and from it you can gauge all directions and know where you're supposed to go. And so for my life, when I met Swamiji and then from him learned about Master and took Kriya and began to study and practice these teachings, what it became was there was this constant note, and I could measure everything in relation to it. It wasn't by any means that I could always align to it, but I could always tell which way was the right direction for me. And I could spin just like the Indian musicians do. You know, you can improvise and you can create extraordinary new melodies, you can do all sorts of things, but it was entirely different when it was always in relation to this fixed reality and absorbed, not in the highest sense of losing attachment and involvement with my own individuality. Such a state has never been given to me, but absorbed in it in the sense that it's the foundation principle of my existence, and just nothing can move me off of it. At least nothing I've met so far. I was very, again, this is another one of those interesting moments when you realize something about yourself. I flew to India, and it must have been the first time I'd gone all by myself. I think it was. I was going to do something there, and everyone that I was going to relate to was already there. And I flew through I took Korean Airlines, or Asiana, I think it was. Very nice. And we stopped in the capital of South Korea, Seoul, South Korea. I'd never been there. I didn't come out of the airport. It was completely unfamiliar to me. And I had a few hours, interlude there before I got on the next plane and continued on to Delhi or wherever I was going. And I just had this. It was a little bit fearful, but it was also just a fantasy. What if? What if all systems crash and I'm stranded in South Korea for the rest of my life? I can't get out of South Korea. Here I am completely alone, nobody to relate to. Here I am in South Korea. And I just sort of, sometimes I see there's different ways to deal with fears. One way to deal with fear is say, well, it's never going to happen. It's not really going to happen. I'm just fantasizing. It's never going to happen. The other is, what if it does happen? I try, and not in all cases, but I try as much as possible to deal with the fear by assuming it will come true, not to manifest it. I know that's another way of thinking it, but not to manifest it, but just to face it. What if it does happen? I can't guarantee that it won't. So here I am stranded forever in South Korea. And I thought, what would I do? And I thought, well, first I'd have to learn Korean, and that's going to take some time. And like most immigrants, no matter how highly educated they are, if they don't speak the language, they can't manifest their intelligence until they can. So you have to do manual work generally. So I'd clean houses or, do whatever the equivalent of would be. I would just do whatever I had to do to live until I learned Korean. And then I would open an Ananda center. And it was just like, of course I would. Because what else would I do? It's just what I would do. And it was partly a joke, but it wasn't. It was be absorbed. Be absorbed in what's really important to you. And let everything that you do and think and feel, let it emanate from that absorption. And you'll be amazed how your life will come into order. So, my friends, God bless you.